Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to my webinar called All Alone, Children Forced to Defend Themselves in Immigration Court. So in this webinar, my goal really is to bring awareness to an issue that I think is really too often overlooked and should be talked about more in the United States in regards to immigration. And the issue is this, the laws and events that cause so many immigrant children to appear in court and defend why they should stay in the United States all by themselves, without a lawyer, and so often too without their parents or guardians. So I'm going to discuss why these children end up alone and give you a glimpse at what it's like for them through some stories. And I'm also going to discuss the aspects of the immigration court system that result in them having no lawyer and going through such a difficult process all by themselves. And then lastly, I'm going to share some of my thoughts based on the research I've done on what I think could help these children all have a fair chance at living in the United States, as well as some ways that we can contribute to the cause and what we can do now. First, I'm going to look at why they're without their parents or guardians, and then we're going to look into why they're without lawyers. So a very common and increasingly common reason that they're without their parents or guardians is that they cross the border and arrive in the United States all by themselves. They're unaccompanied minors, officially called unaccompanied alien children, or UAC for short. And these kids travel from their country, most commonly now from Central America, to the United States for a number of reasons. So in the past, people fled Central America primarily due to economic reasons and seeking relief from just the misery of living in dire poverty in these war-torn countries. And today these reasons still exist. However, increasingly we're seeing children who are leaving because of the increasing gang violence and threats and rape, and even violence and threats from their own family members. So just think about how bad it must be in those countries and how scared these kids must be to decide to leave everything and make the very difficult journey to the United States and begin this difficult task of applying for relief, just so hopefully they can stay in a country with opportunities for education and a life where, you know, they don't have to wake up every morning wondering if it could be their last. So here is an example of an unaccompanied child in their journey, and I'm going to tell you about Jose. He left Guatemala as a teenager, and he traveled for 27 days by foot and bus to Texas. And at the border, he waited another 4 days, and then after crossing another 3 days in the desert without food, before finding Border Patrol agents who put him in a facility that he said was so cold he referred to it as a refrigerator. And he had, you know, it was February, he had no warm clothes, nothing but the t-shirt on his back. And thankfully, he was transferred to a warmer juvenile detention facility in Arizona. But in explaining why he left Guatemala, he said that, you know, there's no work. The most he could get a job was for 1 day, and he couldn't support a family like that. And there was one gang that told him to join them, and he said no, which put him in even more danger. And in the streets, Jose said gang members are either going to the hospital or they're killed. So he made the decision to come to the United States to find safety and opportunity. And now to stay in the United States, Jose's next obstacle will be finding a lawyer, and especially a lawyer that will help him for free since he doesn't have any money. So another reason that children arrive in court without their parents or guardians is that they're separated from their parents at the border. And last year, as I'm sure you all know and saw in the news, because of Trump's zero tolerance policy, a lot of kids were separated from their parents or guardians because they were taken into federal custody and the kids couldn't be held with them. And this practice was horrible for so many reasons, which we don't have time to go into right now. But before this policy, and now after this policy has ended, children were and still are separated from their parents or guardians at the border for a number of reasons. And these can include if the adult is falsely claiming to be their parent, or is a threat to the child, or is criminal or gang affiliated, then the child is taken from them and they're treated as an unaccompanied alien child that we just talked about before. So one of the things that this does mean is that they have to go to immigration court without anyone they know. Maybe the young ones have a caseworker, maybe a lawyer if they're very lucky. But even so, they don't know these people. And the caseworkers don't always even stay in the courtroom with them, so they end up alone. And they have to do this in a regular courtroom, you know, no matter how old they are. So just to give you a glimpse at what this is like for young children who are separated from their parents or guardian and then have to go to immigration court. So I'm going to tell you about Fernanda, and her story comes from Vivian Yee and Miriam Jordan, as they told it in the New York Times. So Fernanda came before the bench in federal immigration courtroom number 14, and she was so small she had to be lifted into the chair. Even the judge in her black robes breathed a soft ah as her latest case perched on the brown leather. Her feet stuck out from the seat in small gray sneakers, her legs too short to dangle. Her fists were stuffed under her knees. As soon as the caseworker who had sat her there turned to go, she let out a whimper that rose to a thin howl, her crumpled face a bursting dam. The girl, Fernanda Jacqueline Davila, was 2 years old, a brief life and a long journey. Her caseworker was the only person in the room she had met before that day. "How old are you?" the judge asked after she had motioned for the caseworker to return to Fernanda's side and the tears had stopped. "Do you speak Spanish?" An interpreter bent toward the child and caught her eye, repeating the question in Spanish. Fernanda's mouse-brown pigtails brushed the back of the chair, but she stayed silent, eyes big. She's nodding her head," the judge said, peering down from the bench through black-rimmed glasses. This afternoon in New York Immigration Court, this judge had nearly 30 children to hear from, ages 2 through 17, and Fernanda was number 26. Fernanda was raised by her grandparents and had been separated from her grandmother at the border, who had brought her to the US to try and give her a better life. Now, Johan, being one, was thankfully one of the lucky ones. A lawyer took his case pro bono and offered his time free to help him. But the judge still had to ask Johan if he understood the proceedings. And the judge said he was embarrassed to ask if the defendant understood the proceedings, naturally. And he said, "I don't know who you would explain it to unless you think that a 1-year-old could learn immigration law." So these are children, they're toddlers who don't speak any English and might not even know how to speak at all, being dragged into an intimidating courtroom without their parents or anyone they know, and so often even without a lawyer, in front of these judges who ultimately decide their fate. So people who have been inside these courts, they say that the kids are, so nervous and restless, and some of them even dress up in suits and dresses to make a good impression on the judge. And one person witnessed, the kids, they settled onto wooden benches and they listened carefully to this female employee, and she was speaking Spanish to them. And she said, "If you don't have an attorney, please follow me to the waiting room." And that was pretty much all of them. So there was approximately 20 children there that day, and only 2 of them had representation. All right, so far we've looked at the 2 main reasons why these children are in court without their parents or guardians. They're unaccompanied or they've been separated. And we've heard that they're so often there without a lawyer as well. So now let's look at why these kids are so often there without a lawyer, and why they have no representation or counsel, and why they're left to somehow try and defend their case and give a legal defense all by themselves, as to why they should stay without a knowledge of the law, the courts, the process, really even the English language. So to put this simply, for right now, they have no right. They don't have the right to a government-funded attorney in court. So immigrants in court only have the right to legal representation if they can find and afford an attorney on their own. And this even applies to these children, no matter how young they are. But as you can imagine how difficult it is for them to find an attorney, these children come across the border, they have no money, and they often don't even know what an attorney is. So social worker David F. Brand, he puts it so well. He says, "For children who escaped violence and poverty in their native countries and survived treacherous treks to the US border, immigration court looms as the next nightmare. Without some right place, right time, good fortune, they rarely have a lawyer guiding them through their first few frightening court dates." So this picture here is of unaccompanied minors being processed by Border Patrol. And all of their stories are different. Some of them may have family in the United States. Some of them may have come to escape their family. Some may be fleeing death threats from gangs or violence, or just seeking a better life with real opportunity. But whatever their story is, we know that each of them faces a long, lonely journey of fighting to stay in the United States ahead of them. And part of that process for them will likely look like this video that I am going to play for you now.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Immigration Judge William Snoffer, sitting in the Immigration Court in Portland, Oregon. These are removal proceedings in the matter of Lisa Gonzalez. The respondent is present in court, but without an attorney. For the government this morning, Mr. Shore is appearing on behalf of the Office of Chief Counsel. Also present here in court is the Spanish translator. Now, to the respondent, do you speak and understand Spanish?
Sí.
Do you want this hearing conducted in Spanish?
Sí.
Government charges that you're a native and citizen of El Salvador and that you are present in the United States without legal permission or parole. Have you talked to an immigration attorney?
No sé.
Do you have an attorney? Are you a little nervous this morning? See? Do you understand what these proceedings here in court are all about? You know what a lawyer is? No? Do you have a lawyer? No?
All right, so unfortunately I don't have time to show you the whole video, but I am putting the link here in the chat box, so if you want to watch the whole thing later, you can. And no footage is allowed to be taken in court, so actors used court transcripts to recreate what it was like in this video, and I think they did a really powerful job. And also, if you notice at the beginning when the judge asked the first girl if she had spoken with an attorney, she said no say, which means I don't know. So she doesn't know what's going on. She doesn't even know if she's spoken to an attorney. And this really speaks to just how difficult and confusing this process is for them and why they need someone to represent them from the very beginning. So whether or not an unaccompanied minor has an attorney has been found to be the single most important factor influencing the case's outcome and whether the child is deported. So for example, let's look at fiscal years 2012 through 2014. And during these 2 years, as you can see on the left, for the cases that had no attorney, a removal order was given to 80% of the children and only 15% were allowed to stay in the United States. And then another 5% took the voluntary departure option. And then on the right, when represented by an attorney, the removal orders dropped all the way to 12%, and the number of children allowed to stay in the US went up to 73%. So it is so important that these children have an attorney, but the number of unaccompanied children who are not represented is increasing. So you can see here in 2015, 29% were unrepresented, and then this went all the way up to 40% in 2016, and then up to 76% of the children who were without an attorney in 2017. And you know, all of these children really deserve an equal chance to stay in the United States. But since so many children cannot get access to an attorney, they're sent right back to the misery and the dangers that they fled from. So in the United States, under criminal law, criminals do have the right to a court-appointed, government-funded attorney, even if they can't pay for one. And this is good, but it doesn't extend to immigrants, most of whom are not criminals, and even to immigrant children, so they don't have this right. So in the United States, here's what we find. Immigrants and these young immigrant children who are often running from gangs and criminals are not given the same rights in court as criminals. So, you know, these accused murderers, rapists, thieves, you know, it's good that they have these rights in court, but they have more rights in court than these young children, many of whom are just fleeing for their lives. But why? Why is this the case? Well, in the United States, immigration law is classified as civil law, and deportation is a civil, not criminal sanction. So immigrants requesting relief and facing removal, they're not given the constitutional protections provided to criminal defendants. And this includes the right to a court-appointed government-funded attorney. So, like I said before, they only have representation if they can find and afford it on their own, which is very difficult, and they often don't. Yet, in every immigration case, as you saw in the video, the government is represented by an experienced attorney, regardless of whether the immigrant is represented or what age they are. So yes, these young kids, these toddlers, 4, 5, 10-year-olds, whatever their age, not only are they often expected to provide a legal defense as to why they should stay in the country all by themselves, but they're always doing it against an experienced attorney. And this next part that I'm going to talk about regarding criminal law, it doesn't apply to these children because these children aren't criminally charged. But I do want to talk about it really quick because it is important and I don't want there to be any confusion. Because some of you might be thinking, well, what about the immigrants who cross the border illegally? Wouldn't they be charged with a crime? And as a criminal, wouldn't they have the right to a government-funded attorney? So crossing the border illegally, it is a misdemeanor. And if caught, the immigrant will be criminally prosecuted. And this falls under federal court jurisdiction and it's not technically considered part of the immigration court system. However, they still don't have the right to an attorney because with misdemeanors, there's no right to funded counsel if the proceedings do not result in a sentence of incarceration. And when you cross the border illegally, your sentence is deportation, not incarceration. So you still don't get an attorney if you can't pay for one. And also, there is a widespread misconception that I just want to clear up really quick. Some people think, well, wouldn't this apply to all undocumented immigrants? Whenever and wherever they're caught, aren't they charged with a crime and wouldn't they be sent to criminal court too? Well, not unless they actually committed a real crime. Living undocumented in the United States is not actually a violation of criminal law. And the majority of undocumented immigrants, they actually came in legally, but then they overstayed their visas. So this undocumented presence in the United States is not a crime under federal law, and they're not going to be criminally prosecuted. They're going to be in civil immigration court. So those immigrants who are arrested, let's say in a work raid or something, and they're just trying to make a life for themselves and for their families and trying not to be deported, and stay in the United States, they still don't have the right to an attorney if they can't find one on their own, and they'll likely be giving this defense against deportation all on their own. So now that I've kind of cleared that up, let's go back to what specifically impacts these kids. So we established that immigration law is civil, but if we look at this timeline of the immigration court system, you may notice something interesting. So in 1891, immigration was put under federal control, but in the Department of the Treasury. And then in 1903, it moved to the Department of Commerce and Labor. And then when this was split in 1913, it went to the Department of Labor. And then in 1940, immigration moved from the Department of Labor to the Department of Justice, where it still is today. So what you may have noticed is that the immigration court system is not and never has been part of the judicial branch of the United States with the other courts in the United States. So what does this actually mean? Well, this is a problem because the Department of Justice is part of the executive branch. And this means that unlike courts and judges in the judicial branch, immigration court is not independent of the executive branch. And immigration judges are essentially employees of the Attorney General. So important things like freedom from political influence don't apply in these proceedings. And so essentially these courts can be and have been used as instruments of the Trump and other presidents' administration's immigration agenda. And also the US Attorney General has all of the power. The US Attorney General can unilaterally overturn any immigration court case, and the US Attorney General can make highly politicized significant decisions, such as this one, where our previous Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, said that immigration judges must complete 700 cases a year. And he decided that this is how he was going to measure their success and how they could receive a satisfactory rating. Remember, they're his employees, so he can rate them and do this. So he really put a lot of pressure on them to rush and compromise cases, and a lot of judges were really upset about this. And then he also made this decision that gang violence and domestic violence were no longer basis for asylum. So if you think about how many children were fleeing their country because of gang violence, and Sessions, he was just like, no, not grounds for asylum anymore. So thankfully, in December, the federal district court ruled that this policy was in violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act, because it really had horrible implications for these kids. But the Attorney General was still able to set this policy in the first place, and politically based decisions like this one, it could occur again in the future. So really quick, I just want to look at how complicated it is for these kids. So there's a lot of different types of reliefs that they can apply for. So these three are fear-based types of relief: asylum, withholding of removal, and convention against torture. And then these three are if they're a victim of something. They can apply for U visas, T visas, and special immigrant juvenile status. And I'm not going to take the time to go into each one, but without the rights to a funded lawyer, how are these kids who can't get a lawyer really supposed to know which one of these to apply for and which one will give them the best chance of staying in the United States? You know, and what all the requirements are for each one, and just how to give the best defense for themselves to actually be able to meet these requirements and get the relief that they're applying for. So there's an ongoing case that really illustrates this very well. It's CJLG versus Sessions. And CJ arrived in the United States from Honduras in 2014. And through a series of hearings, he was denied all three of those types of relief based on credible fear that we saw before: asylum, withholding of removal, and convention against torture. And in 2016, he filed an appeal, and one of the issues he listed was that the judge didn't inform him of the other types of relief he was applying for. So he was applying for convention against torture, which this is actually one of the hardest ones to apply for, and you have to prove the hardest things. But he wasn't informed of, let's say, the special immigrant juvenile status, which is something that he was probably more likely to obtain. He didn't have a lawyer. He had no way of knowing this. And it's especially frustrating because he came from Honduras, like I said, as a teenager, and a Mara gang, there most likely MS-13, had tried to recruit him, but he resisted them. And as you can imagine, this went badly, and they threatened him, and they even held a gun to his head. And when asked why he was afraid to go back to Honduras, he said simply, "When I arrive there, they will kill me." So the court did find that he had a well-founded fear of persecution, but they, upheld that he didn't meet the requirements for convention against torture, which is very difficult. How could he, really, without a lawyer? So this case is cited a lot, too, because the appeals court judges upheld that he didn't meet the requirements, but they also ruled and upheld that alien minors are not entitled to government-funded, court-appointed counsel, and that CJ really hadn't shown that he needed counsel, which he very much did. So in 2018, this case thankfully was ordered to be heard en banc, which means that in December it went before a panel of 11 federal appeals court judges, and then they can decide to overrule the appellate court's decision. This picture is not of that case. I couldn't find one of CJ's case, so this is a picture of a completely different topic, but it's still an en banc situation, still an en banc hearing. So you can see that there's the panel of 11 judges, and then the person who is presenting the case and the arguments. So in CJ's case, the panel has not yet come to a decision, but I really hope they come to a good decision, of course, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens, because this will really be a significant decision, not just for CJ, but it'll impact a lot of unaccompanied children. And right now, CJ is living in Los Angeles, and he's attending school while he waits for the outcome of his case, but he's still living every day in fear that they could make the decision to deport him. This is a different topic for a different time, but keep in mind that kids who leave their countries and come to the States and then are deported back, it's even worse for them the second time after they return to their country. So if he has to go back, it'll be probably even worse for him. And here you can see the breakdown by year. If you look all the way down at the bottom, 70 cases were still pending in 2017 that had started in 2005. And I mean, you can look at these other ones. There's 2014, over 16,000 cases that had started in 2014 were still pending. And these are a lot of shocking numbers, and I want to personalize this a little bit. This picture is of unaccompanied minors who have crossed the border, and they're going to be taken in and processed by border control, and then they're going to begin the long process of seeking relief. So looking at these kids who have crossed the border, only 1 or 2 of them will probably be able to get a lawyer, which means the rest of them are going to have to navigate this confusing process in a new country all on their own. And I mean, just look at how small some of them are. Look at this boy in the blue shirt on the left. And, you know, some of these kids could be waiting 3, 4, 5, 10, even 12 years with multiple hearings before they find out if they can stay. So my goal at this webinar was really to help you become aware of this issue that is really overlooked, I think, and not widely talked about in conversations surrounding immigration here in the States. And as we come to a close, I just want to share with you some of my thoughts on what can be done and what we can all do. So first, naturally, providing these children with court-appointed government-funded attorneys. If all immigrant minors that came in were provided with a funded attorney, estimates are that it would cost $276.1 million per year. So that does seem like a lot, but if we put this into perspective, we do have this wall that is being built, and that's another topic for another time, but over $1 billion going to this wall. What it would cost to give these children lawyers is only a fraction of that amount. And really, if the wall is trying to keep criminals and gang members out, let's not keep these kids who are running from those criminals and gang members out there with them. And to do this, they really need lawyers. And then second, providing more funding for immigration courts. You can see this line of people waiting outside an immigration court. It's just very backed up and it's a mess. So hiring more immigration judges, that really needs to be done. And Jeff Sessions actually, as part of his initiative to help solve this backlog, he did hire more immigration court judges, but it wasn't even close to the amount that needed to be hired. And he also, as we saw, said things like the 700 case quota, which wasn't as helpful as something like hiring a lot more judges would be. And then finally, that the immigration court system needs to gain independence from the Department of Justice and the executive branch, and really out from under the power of the Attorney General, so they can receive the same freedoms as the courts and the judicial branch. And last year, there was the National Association of Immigration Judges did call on Congress to do this, but so far nothing has happened, and it's still under the executive branch. So really quick, I know that we're running over time, but what can we do? Obviously, raise awareness, help spread the word, really make this this part of the immigration conversation in the United States, make these courts and the challenges that these kids face and their personal stories, add these to the conversation, talk to people. We can write op-eds using social media, advocate on these kids' behalf, and also on behalf of the immigration judges who are strained and overloaded. And, just show them your support, show them you have their backs. You can join and support existing advocacy groups. For example, there's the Immigration Justice Campaign. I'm going to just put that in the chat box, the link really quick. This is just one of them, but one of the things they do is they're advocating for due process for these kids, which includes the right to a government-funded attorney. And then donating. A lot of organizations are organizing these lawyers who are willing to donate their time for free, and they're helping them with trainings and things so that they can give the best defense to these kids, for these kids. And really, since there's no policy that gives these kids government-funded attorneys, this is the next best thing to try and get all of these kids representation in court. So there's a lot of great ones. I don't necessarily want to advocate one or two over the others, but I'm just going to put some examples here. This is the National Immigrant Justice Center and Kids in Need of Defense. But there's so many of these organizations. There's some that might be in your area locally. Just look and see what work they're doing and consider supporting them if you'd like. And then really, I just encourage you to stay informed, do your research, and encourage everyone else around you to do the same. A lot of times, you know, you need to look a little deeper at something to really get a clear picture rather than just relying on what they're saying on a couple news sites, for example. And if any legislation comes up that you can support, or the opportunity to vote on a proposition or for a public official comes up and it's something to do with this topic, do vote and support. We can make a huge difference by voting, but I encourage you not to make a decision until you take into account all of these different perspectives, including the perspectives of these immigrants and these young children, and their thoughts and feelings and what they're going through.